There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Acts. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. Where on one side of Corinth was the Adriatic Sea, and on the other side, it was the Aegean Sea. So all trade and all travel, it all went through Corinth. Because going through the Isthmus of Corinth, you only had to go like 3.5 miles, where this not only saved them time from sailing, but they didn't have to sail around this part of Greece. So it kept them from having to sail this very treacherous area, especially during the winter months. And it kept them from having to sail in the open seas. So that means that everyone in the Roman Empire, they passed through Corinth. Where the Corinth Isthmus was so famous, they also had the Isthmus Games, which was only second to the Olympics. But it was just like the Olympics, it was just not as famous. But this was a very hard town to live in. It's kind of like living in New York City. If you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. Where one ancient writer said that Corinth was a town where only the tough could survive, because this was the original sin city, known for hedonism and immorality. And the term to be a Corinthian companion, well, that meant to be a prostitute. Or in the classical Greek, where it says to act like a Corinthian, that just meant you were a fornicator. Where in every Greek or Roman play, if you were to play the Corinthian, that means you were always portrayed being drunk. And so this, to me, is how it looked back in the 60s and 70s, like with people like Dean Martin in the Playboy generation, that you're always drunk with a cigarette hanging out of your mouth and you're chasing women. And here you have a whole city of them. They're all living like they're living in Hugh Hefner's Playboy mansion. And in 146 BC, Corinth, they rebelled against Rome. And so Rome, they came and they destroyed the city of Corinth. And it stayed that way for over 100 years until Julius Caesar had the city rebuilt. And then once it was rebuilt, it just became the same city it had always been. It became Sin City and a city of trade. But this was the second most important city in the Roman Empire because it had an important military outpost. And so now you have Paul here, and he's all alone because Timothy and Silas, they're still back in Berea. But God, he doesn't leave Paul alone long. And it says that Paul found a certain Jew named Aquila, who was from Pontus. Now, Pontus is in northern Turkey on the coast of the Black Sea. So this Aquila, he's not close to his home. And he's in Corinth with his wife Priscilla. And you just have to notice that their names are just too cute. They match. It's like Barry and Sherry and Haley and Bailey, or Danny and Annie. You have this Aquila and Priscilla. And now we know that Aquila, that he's a Jew. But we don't know if Priscilla was born a Jew or if she was just a converted Jew from marriage, because that name Priscilla is derived from the name Prisca. And Prisca was one of the greatest socialite families in Rome. It was a name from high society, where she was probably related to that family somehow. And when you read 2 Timothy 4:19, Paul, he actually calls her Prisca. And it seems like Aquila and Priscilla, that they were Christians when they met Paul. So they may have come from the Roman church in Rome, which was a church that Paul didn't plant. Where at this time, Paul, he had never been to Rome because he had mentioned that he wanted to go see them when he wrote his letter to the Romans, where that letter to the Romans was actually written by Paul from Corinth. And so when you see Paul and he's describing all the sins of the Gentile lifestyle that he writes in his letter to the Romans, you know that Paul, that he's seeing this lifestyle played out every day in front of him in Corinth. But if Aquila and Priscilla, if they weren't Christians when they came to Corinth, they became Christians quickly after they met Paul, where the only reason the couples in Corinth is that they were kicked out of Rome with the other 20,000 Jews there. And that's because the Emperor Claudius commanded all the Jews to leave Rome because of the uprisings by the Jews in Rome. And it's believed by some that those uprisings occurred because of Jesus being introduced into some of the synagogues in the city of Rome. And this expulsion of the Jews, it came about in 49 AD. And it was all because of these constant riots. But the information about the riots and why they were kicked out, it's not very clear. So we don't have a real clear picture. But Paul, he joins these other Jewish tent makers, which means that they're all workers in leather. Although in Tarsus, they also had black goat hair cloth tents, and Tarsus is the city where Paul's from. So now you have Paul, and he's working with his hands so that he can support himself in ministry. And so this would stop anyone from accusing Paul of seeking converts for cash, that he was not in this for the money, like the false prophets were. Where in Judaism, the teachers, they never received money from their students. And that's why the father of a teacher, that he always taught their sons a trade so that they would be able to help support themselves. Where Gamaliel said, if you don't teach your son a trade, you teach him to be a thief. And there would have been a lot of demand for tents in Corinth because of all the people coming into town, especially around the times of the Isthmus Games. And then there were always sailors coming into the port. But Paul, he doesn't only just work with this lovely couple, but he also lives with them, where Aquila and Priscilla, they become these indispensable partners in his ministry, where they actually end up having a church in their home. And we'll see throughout Paul's life, he will have contact with them till the end of his life, where in Paul's very last letter, the very last letter he ever wrote, which was to Timothy, where in 2 Timothy at the very end, at the very last chapter, in chapter 4, which is only written months before he was beheaded by Nero, Priscilla and Aquila, they're the very last people he says hi to, which is really him saying goodbye. Where at that time, he'd already known this couple for 15 years. And so what they did is they worked all week making tents, and then on the Sabbath, they would go to the synagogue to persuade Jews and Greeks about Jesus. And there is an inscription that had been found in Corinth that confirms that they did have a synagogue of the Hebrews. And then we finally have Timothy and Silas show up. And then they bring Paul this really good news about Thessalonica, that this church is going strong. Where Paul here, he responds to that news, and he immediately writes the Thessalonian church a letter, which is the first letter to the Thessalonians, which is actually what we're studying on Wednesday nights. And he wrote this to encourage them, because if you remember, Paul, he only had 3 weeks before he was forced out of Thessalonica. And actually, in Corinth, he writes both of his letters to the Thessalonians, also along with that letter to the Romans. And we know from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians that Timothy, that he also brought Paul financial support from the Philippian church. So now Paul, he can set aside his tent making for a while, and he can minister full-time building the church in Corinth. Where Paul, he does this by teaching at the synagogue. And it's here where it says that Paul is being compelled to do this by the Spirit. So this is the Holy Spirit giving God's message of salvation to the Jews of that synagogue through Paul. And then it says that they opposed him. And then it says that they blasphemed, which means that they're blaspheming Jesus. So you got to go, well, what else could Paul do? Because he's trying to reach them, but here they're rejecting Jesus. So now Paul, he shakes out his garments, and that's exactly what Jesus said to do to his disciples. He said to shake off the dust of your feet from those who refuse you as a testimony against them. But this is also what any Jew would do when they came back into Israel from any Gentile land, where they wanted nothing with them from that place, to shake it all out, which is kind of like us saying, we're going to wash our hands of you.
And then Paul, he says, let your blood be upon your own heads. And that's meaning that he's not going to be guilty for them being condemned or for them going to hell because he gave them the truth, but they rejected it. And so this is like Ezekiel chapter 33, where if Ezekiel didn't warn the people, he was responsible for their blood. But if he warned them, their blood was on their own head. And so these guys, they understand exactly what Paul's saying. And then Paul says, I am clean. From now on, I go to the Gentiles. Where Paul, he has said this exact same thing way back in chapter 13 when he was with Barnabas. And so then he gets up in a huff and he leaves the synagogue. And what he really does is he just goes next door to Justus's house, because Justus's house, it actually shared a common wall with the synagogue. So it's not like he went very far, and it's not like the Jews didn't know where to find Paul. He was just next door if they ever wanted to change their mind. And Paul, reasoning with the Jews at the synagogue, it actually did bear some fruit, because we find that the actual ruler of the synagogue, that he believed. And his name was Crispus. And they say that he was the sweetest guy in the synagogue. And I believe they called him Krispy Kremes. I'm not sure. And not only Crispy got saved, but the whole Cream family. They all believed and they all were saved. And we know from 1 Corinthians that Crispus was one of the very few people that Paul baptized himself personally. Where Paul, he didn't baptize a lot of people. And then this Justus, that man who had that house right next to the synagogue, where it shared a wall with the synagogue, his full name is believed to be Gaius Titus Justus, where this Gaius is another person who Paul baptized. And in this very same verse, it says that a lot of people were baptized. It just wasn't Paul that was baptizing them personally. And if you look at how many people Paul baptized in 1 Corinthians 1, I think I've baptized more people than him in just our little church here, because I baptized Scott and Jeremy and Salem and Alyssa and Corey and Jonathan O'Neill, and they all still go to church here. And it's not like I'm trying to compete with Paul, but if I am, I'm winning. But if you need to get baptized, I'm your guy. Me or Pastor John, he can be your guy. But everybody should remember being baptized. And if you can't remember being baptized, we should take care of that this summer down there at the lake, where you make a public proclamation of giving your life to Jesus Christ. All right, so it seems here like Paul, he's leaving the synagogue on bad terms. And so it seems like he's afraid that they might retaliate, because it's always been these Jewish leaders who haven't believed in Paul's message that have been consistent on persecuting Paul. And so it could be that Paul here, that he's actually thinking about leaving the city of Corinth because of all these troubles. And then God gives Paul a vision in the night, where the first thing that God says to Paul is, don't be afraid, which means Paul was afraid.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.